Friends, Brian here from Middle Aged Mind and Muscle. Welcome to the humble abode once again. This is my view from where I work, my studio. Let me do this video for you so you can see it. This is where I work, my friends. Right here. This is where I work. When you hear the name Jim Hellwig, the Ultimate Warrior, what do you think? So, my good friend Myron posted an interesting thing on my YouTube the other day, and in the comment section, and it brought back some memories. Plus, I have a special bonus for you guys. Hold on tight. I remember Jim Hellwig long before he was the Ultimate Warrior, when he was actually Blade Runner Rock in the UWF and the Dingo Warrior in WCCW. And I knew that because of all the wrestling magazines. I was an avid wrestling fan, bought magazines. Up in Canada, we weren't lucky enough to get the TV shows of those productions. But nonetheless, it was like, oh my God, this guy's amazing. Look at how he looks. So as a young, burgeoning lifter, 12, 13, I had pictures of the Dingo Warrior and Blade Runner Rock up in our little laundry room gym that I had. Crappy York bench, crappy York weights, but I had some pictures up on the wall. God bless my parents. They must have thought, what is wrong with this kid? Anyway, he always inspired me with my lifting. And so I, in fact, learned what the Ultimate Warrior, that time the Dingo Warrior, what his real name was, Jim Hellwig, because my friend had this bodybuilding book called Super High Intensity Bodybuilding by Ellington Darden. And the guy on the cover, I'm like looking at him going, I think that's the Dingo Warrior. And they mentioned his name in the book. So even before he became the Ultimate Warrior, I knew he was Jim Hellwig. And then, of course, came to the WWF, became very famous. And that's history, my friends. So, like everyone else, I saw all the drama between him, Vince McMahon over the years. Was so happy to hear he was going in the Hall of Fame, and like a lot of you, I was crushed when he died. It was very, very sad. A lot of people don't know this, even some friends and family, but I actually did a couple of stints as a professional wrestler. It's true. When I got out of college in '96, I went, paid my money, got trained to be a professional wrestler. Weekends, worked the independents here in Canada, and then later on I did a few stints with Great North Wrestling. And yes, that is me, yours truly, wrestling with the Honky Tonk Man. You know, it's often funny, no matter what, especially back then, as soon as you mention pro wrestling, people treat you differently. They treat you really weird, like you're a pariah or something. And people always have to take the opportunity to say, well, it's fake. And you know, like it's very old. For a lot of people, I always want to say, so when you watch Yellowstone, or you watch this show, or you watch that, is it real, or can we just be allowed to enjoy it? But I can tell you, even from a guy who's fairly tough, you go out and you work the pro wrestling circuit, you're going to learn very quickly you have to be tough to make it in that business. One memorable experience I want to tell you guys about, May of '97, I worked on a card on an independent circuit, and the Brooklyn Brawler, Steve Lombardi, was on it. Steve was a great guy. You know, I actually got to spend an afternoon with him. Of course, he wouldn't remember who the hell I am now. And Steve was very nice. He was gracious. Told us a lot of stories. I marked out a bit. I was asking him a lot of questions about the Ultimate Warrior. Graciously answered. So I heard all the stories about how in the beginning, when he first came to the WWF, all he ate were cans of tuna all the time, and it smelled up the dressing room. People didn't like that. How he'd get tired of shaking people's hands going, oh, I just said hi to you yesterday. Why do I have to say hi again? But he had a lot of good things to say about Jim Hellwig. And at the time, I was pretty jacked. And Steve said to me, he said, he wanted to know what I was on, and I didn't tell him. And he's like, why won't you tell me what drugs you're on? Are you kayfabing the boys? After that, you guys probably know the origins of this YouTube channel were actually for me to upload some videos of my experiences from a previous YouTube channel from 6 years ago. But during that time, this is where it gets a little interesting for you guys, and my gift, Christmas gift for you guys. Not long after Jim Hellwig died, a website popped up. It was about the biography of the Ultimate Warrior. Now, the owner of this website was Chad Ventures. Who's Chad Ventures? So I remember really reading through the site, and I said, this guy knows what he's talking about. I can have a discussion with this guy. And we did, if I may say, for Ultimate Warrior fans, a pretty epic discussion that I had up on my old YouTube channel, which I'm going to share with you guys. I don't know if I'm going to split it into parts, because it's one very long conversation, but I think you guys will really like it. My good friend Myron told me a story about how he was disappointed when he met the Ultimate Warrior in person. And I remember when I was in high school, a guy in my high school, his older brother was a huge Ultimate Warrior fan. So we're looking at 88, 89, and he happened to go to the Gold's Gym in the city I lived in, which was the city of Ottawa. I'm driving in Ottawa, man. driving in Ottawa. He went up to the Ultimate Warrior, was very polite, and said, "Oh my God, you know, the whole thing," and the Ultimate Warrior was quite rude to him. So Jim Hellwig is a very interesting person. You know, Myron told me he didn't have a good experience meeting him. I can tell you guys, I told you recently a story of me meeting a celebrity in the fitness lifting industry, someone who won multiple Mr. Olympias, really passes himself off to be a really nice guy, but who's the biggest jackass I ever met. And I got to tell him that a few years later at the Arnold Classic. But, you know, a part of me is kind of glad I never met Jim Hellwig, because that would have truly crushed me if I had a bad experience. Have you guys ever met him? Comment below about your experience. And also, he was a very controversial figure. I have to say I didn't agree with everything I read about what he had said when he went on to do his speeches and everything. Things I'm not even going to get into. Let's keep it positive. But you guys can imagine my surprise many years later to see the A&E Biography and Chad Ventures is on it. I was so happy for Chad. He was a great guy. We had an amazing conversation. I had really hoped that we could have done another one, but at that time, my life was very turbulent. A lot of stuff was going on. But Chad, if you're out there, make sure to say hi. We'll reconnect again, and I'm very happy for you. It really warmed my heart. I was very, very glad to see you on that show about the A&E Biography of the Ultimate Warrior. So, all my friends out there who are my age, without a doubt, in one way or another, the Ultimate Warrior probably inspired you with your lifting, and I can say for me that he was a huge influence. Even to this day, sometimes I'll watch some of his videos. Again, I don't agree with everything he said, but some of the stuff he talks about, having the strength of mind, strength of character, doing the work of your life, I get it now. When I was younger, I was kind of like, what the hell is this guy talking about? So anyway, this is a very long and very detailed discussion I had about Jim Hellwig, the Ultimate Warrior, with the Ultimate Warrior biographer, Chad Ventures. I hope you guys like it. Remember, I really appreciate when you click like, click subscribe. It means a lot to me. And let me know what you think. Comment below. This is my therapy. As today, I have a very special guest, and his name is Chad Ventures. Now, Chad has done a lot of research and review work on the Ultimate Warrior. Now, my first experience with Chad came on the day Jim Hellwig died. I went online, and Chad had a website up, and the name of the website was, Chad?
ultimatewarriorbio.wordpress.com.
Okay. And I was absolutely fascinated as a piece of work. Now, we want to make this interview more about the Ultimate Warrior, not the cocky jerk. So, but I just want to say that, you know, having worked in the professional wrestling industry, the Ultimate Warrior and Jim Hellwig was a big influence on me as a teenager growing up. And I started working out seriously in 1986 when I was 12, 13 years old. And this was right around when the Ultimate Warrior was, he would have been Blade Runner Rock in the UWF, and then he became the Dingo Warrior and World Class Championship Wrestling. Now, so I was a fan of his long before he was in the WWE. And as I was saying earlier, Chad, as a bodybuilder, a bodybuilding enthusiast, I had pictures of, I had a little weight room in the furnace room of our house, and I had pictures of the Dingo Warrior up on the wall, and it wasn't like in the homosexual sense, it was in the bodybuilding sense, saying, wow, you know, I want to be jacked, like, this motivates me when I'm doing my preacher curls on this little preacher bench, I want to look like this dude. Mm-hmm. And I know a lot of bodybuilders out there probably owe their start to Jim Hellwig, and you are an absolute vast mountain of knowledge when it comes to the Ultimate Warrior, and I have to say that I've done my share of my own history lore on him and followed his career, and I've always found him to be a very fascinating individual, and I have some my own stories from meeting some professional wrestlers that have worked with him. So I'm really excited today to have Chad Ventures. Chad, thank you for entering the House of Gains. And
thank you, cocky jerk. I appreciate it.
Yes, okay. No one is more cocky. But anyway, so what I'd like to start off, just give us a quick little background on yourself and your interest in the Ultimate Warrior and how that developed.
Sure. Well, my background is that I'm actually an independent contractor. I do a lot of speaking and teaching, and specifically, my area of expertise is early Christianity. So I'm actually a New Testament scholar, finishing up my PhD work, The Ultimate Warrior stuff came about partly because as a young kid, I was a huge wrestling fan. And of course, I'm 36 years old. So when I was at the height of my wrestling love is the height of Jim Hellwig's career as the Ultimate Warrior, who to me was just an incredible and fascinating character. And then as the years go by, my love of academics and writing and scholarship sort of meshed with my other love of pop culture. And what inspired me to start looking at the life of Jim Hellwig was actually discovering that contrary to what I had heard in high school, he was not dead, interestingly enough. I had heard the urban legend, and I wasn't watching wrestling at the time, that the original Ultimate Warrior had died. So in the mid-2000s, I had bought one of the Jakks Pacific Classic Ultimate Warrior figures that I saw in Toys R Us from the SummerSlam against Honky Tonk. And it inspired me to kind of look and see if what I'd heard was true. And of course, I found out that he was alive and well and operating a website and everything else. And that's where it all started, was actually that urban legend about him dying launched my interest in it, eventually my desire to write about it.
I found when Jim Hellwig passed away, the research that you put in regarding his history and background, as I've said, when I worked out back when I started, like, I mean, a lot of the viewers here weren't even born in the 80s, and the internet was not around. And but I remember, and your only access to information was through television. And because I lived in Canada, we didn't really have a lot of access to World Class Championship Wrestling or Universal Wrestling Federation programming. So a lot of our access was through wrestling magazines, and we know through the magazines, you know, it was basically it was all work. They were all a work with a little bit of truth dropped in here and there. But, you know, you could just see the dude was just meant for big things. You know, and we pieced together, you know, that, you know, he's a Dingo Warrior, and then before he was Blade Runner Rock, a friend of mine who was really into wrestling at the time as well. But, I mean, really, it was funny. There's a guy in my gym the other day, and he's a wrestling mark, very nice guy. And but he was arguing with the guy saying that you know, Sid Vicious, Psycho Sid, had the best physique in wrestling. I said, dude, no way, man. It was Jim Hellwig. No comparison. Looking back, let's be a little bit more chronological, because I mean, it's a big topic. We're going to do our best to make it time management here. But if we look back into his roots, so I want to make sure that I have the link that I can give people to access your website, and because you delved into the history of Jim Hellwig from his days, from being, I believe he was from Hillsboro, Indiana, and he went to, was it Fountain High School in Indiana?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
And Hillsboro, and there's another little town. It wasn't Crawfordsville, that's where he was born, but there's another town. It was Hillsboro and
yeah, no, there's two or three little towns that dot that area, and I know that, you know, that his birth was reported as being to Thomas Hellwig of Crawfordsville.
Yeah.
And then but he didn't go to Crawfordsville High. One of his good friends from high school went to Crawfordsville. I'm pretty sure he went to Fountain High School, which I think was in Hillsboro, but I'm not sure.
I think it was between the two towns. Yeah, there's two towns. It was Hillsboro, and then there's was it Vetersburg? Was that the name of it?
It could be. I don't remember. Wherever, because there was, part of the thing is that he moved around a little bit as a kid. Because when he was a teenager, especially in his senior year, he actually left living with his mom, and he lived with a teacher of his for a while as well. So he moved around a bit. Yeah,
so, and you had on your website, and I encourage everybody to go check it out and read. It's just fascinating, all the work that Chad put into this amazing website and research. It was a teacher and also a friend of his. And I've heard in her videos after he passed away, Dana Warrior, the Ultimate Warrior's widow, she is referred to Coach Pate, I believe his name was.
Yep, Gary Pate.
Gary Pate. And but you really go into about how they met and befriended each other. But it all started on a rusty universal weight machine that they worked out on to get started. And he also had another friend, and they talk about how he really became interested in developing his physique.
Yep.
So and and I believe he dropped out of football after a couple of years. Did he not?
He did, yeah. Gary, when I first tracked Gary down, which was about in 2009, he was good enough to talk with me for a while, and he noticed Jim on the first day in the football meeting as being what he referred to as basically the epitome of the 90-pound weakling.
Okay.
It's just scrawny, like, oh man, this kid's going to get killed. And Jim didn't last forever in the football realm, but he and Gary started working out together in that kind of crusty old gym.
Yeah.
And he really started to develop. And by his senior year, he had really developed his physique a lot in comparison with that first meeting Gary had with him as a small kid trying to play football.
Yeah. So, and anyway, in a nutshell, because I don't want to kind of touch on it too much because you really go in depth. For someone who has an interest in the Ultimate Warrior, it was just fascinating to read. But basically, and I don't want to say anything that might get anyone into any kind of trouble with the remaining Hellwigs, but it sounded like that he had a challenging youth. He had his issues growing up, and it sounded like what was remarkable when it talked about some of his menial teenage jobs, that he had an attitude of, I'm going to get out of here and I'm going to be somebody.
Absolutely, yeah. I had two independent sources. I had Gary and another friend of his that when they were growing up, that I interviewed both of them, and they both pretty much told me the same story separately. That he really did carry a chip on his shoulder. He felt that a lot of people in that area looked down on him and his family for different reasons, and that he was completely driven to make something of himself, to make it out of the small town, and to make a name. Which, of course, he obviously ended up doing.
Yeah. So again, I don't want to. There's so much to talk about with Jim Hellwig. We could talk here for hours. But so moving on. So as he progressed through high school, I believe he went to Indiana State University.
Yep.
And I'm not sure. Actually, you and I did have a pre-discussion a few months ago, and are arranging to meet each other. Now I might edit this part out, but I always meant to. This is one of the things I meant to talk to you about, and I forgot. And I believe it was in his shoot interview, the one that he did with Ringside Collectibles. He talked about an encounter with this guy at Indiana State, who was a world-class championship shot putter, and he had an experience where he heard the guy talking about steroids. And it said it really affected him. He said because steroids don't make champions. They still don't give you the heart to do the training or something. Did you ever? I always wondered who that guy was.
No clue. I never. It's never an angle I tried to pursue.
Yeah.
With his time there. It would be probably an interesting side note, but I never even once tried to find out who that guy was.
So moving forward, he went to Indiana State, I believe, for a year. And then, at what point was it after that he moved to Florida to... It's very interesting because he didn't have the best relationship with his father, but according to your research, he moved in with his father, I believe was in Hollywood, Florida for a few years after he went to Indiana State?
Yeah, I don't know how long it was. It was probably... I don't think it was a few years. I think it was shorter than that. But there was a period of time that at least... both of his friends from when he was growing up remember that he lived with his dad down there, which is one of those interesting little nuggets of information because given that he did have this rather rocky relationship with his father who left his family when he was a kid, and so understandably he was not happy with that. They did have a time when they lived together. Maybe he was just trying to sort some things out, but it was, maybe a year or two, something like that. But short-lived venture together in Florida.
And of course, all during this time, he was really still stuck with his training. He was training hard. You kind of one of his friends referred to him not training his legs as hard as his upper body at the time. But okay, so just chronologically tracking that. So he would have been in Florida. And he would have really, at some point around there, started getting into his bodybuilding training or competition. So, and then from there, did he move to Georgia to pursue being a chiropractor while he was competing as a bodybuilder?
Yep, yeah, he was even Mr. Georgia. Yes. I think probably around '84. Yeah. So he had achieved some level of success, and by that time, of course, his legs, which had at one point been rather scrawny because he didn't like working them, had really progressed a lot.
And I do know also, I think he also in the junior nationals, I believe it was that year, he placed 5th. The winner was a fellow by the name of Ron Love, who in the 80s went on. He had a pretty good professional bodybuilding career. I've seen him recently. He's in his like mid 60s. He still looks phenomenal. But getting back to now, just to delve into a little bit more, for anyone who doesn't know who Ed Connors is, Ed Connors was an owner and had a hand in the business of, I believe, the original Gold's Gym, or had a hand in the Gold's Gym chain. And what they used to do is they used to sponsor bodybuilding talent across the states. And every year, if they felt someone had potential, they'd bring them out, put them up, and help them out, and help them with their training and stuff. And at one point, Jim Hellwig was one of the people that they picked to come out. So, I mean, Ed Connors could help fill in some of the blanks here, but you did mention to me that you had been talking to him recently.
Absolutely, yeah. So Ed and I had a chance to sit down and talk about Jim's life, and Ed offered some really good perspective because Jim was like a kid to him. And and Jim lived with Ed for a period of time. And as Ed told me, he said Jim had tremendous work ethic, was a really great bodybuilder, but he was too tall to succeed. When I asked him how come he didn't do so great at those junior nationals, he just basically said he's too tall. Jim's 6'3", and that's just a couple of inches at least too tall for that ideal weightlifting height. But Ed was there when Jim then made that transition into wrestling. And Ed, by the way, has had ties with other guys who made it big in wrestling, probably one we've all heard of, John Cena. John Cena and Ed Connors are good friends. And Cena also lived with Ed for a period of time, just like Jim Hellwig had. And he said that Cena still considers Hellwig to be a major inspiration to him in his weightlifting pursuits.
Well, this is the thing. If you look back at that time, there were a lot of great physiques in wrestling, for sure. Like Lex Luger was a very popular one. He would have been up there. In the WWE, I never was a big Hulk Hogan fan, to be honest with you. I never really cared for his physique or thought too much of it. I really connected with the Ultimate Warrior. Hercules was another one at the time. There's a lot of people with good builds, but there's just something about the Warrior. He just stood out. So getting into the wrestling part now. So to go from bodybuilding to wrestling, because I kind of did do something similar, I always get a kick out of people when they come up and say that they want to be a wrestler, and I'm like, they have no idea what they have to go through with the training and stuff. So basically then he got the call from Ed Connors, and he went out to California again. He went back to Georgia he was going to finish up to get his qualifications to be a chiropractor. And he had a lot of exposure to the NWA Crockett wrestling there, like the Ric Flairs, the Road Warriors, all that. He said he'd see them in gyms and see them on TV and stuff. So but he got a call for this wrestling thing. Now, the guy running that camp was this Rick Bassman guy, and I guess he's still kind of around a little bit, dabbling in certain little promotions and stuff. But the Warrior never really, I don't know how much you delved into that, but the Warrior wasn't a big fan of Rick Bassman very much. I don't know quite what went on when there, but yeah. So I'll skip over that part too. Yeah.
And it's just one of those. There's times when, especially according to Warrior's own words, he tends to just sort of glide over things, and that was kind of in those rare shoots that he did. He did tend to kind of glide over the Rick Bassman thing, and with Warrior, it's hard to determine sometimes if the issue was because something actually happened at the time, or because of some slight or perceived slight that maybe occurred later in his chronology. Yeah. Because sometimes those things do affect the way that he talked about people in the future.
Well, and I have to kind of step in here and talk about this one. I mean, Jim Hellwig is a very complex character. And it used to amaze me. I mean, one thing too, like, if you're going to have a gimmick like the Conky Jerk and you got a YouTube channel, you better be prepared to take the heat. And I love it. I love my haters as much as I love like friends and the people that like the channel. But it always amazed me with Hellwig, and I'm not saying this to slight him, but if anyone kind of criticized him or was negative, he would just take it so personally and get so defensive and stir the pot with it, where I'd be like, if I was him, I'd be like, well, I made a lot more money than you in wrestling. Sucks to be you. That would have been my attitude.
Yeah.
But,
yeah, no doubt. Well, and especially, not only he took it very personally and documented in his writings as well, not only against, when his contemporaries said things about him, but I mean, obviously his long and litigious history with the WWE itself.
Yeah.
When WWE did the self-destruction DVD, he went to court for that. He wanted money in return because of what they had said about him on that DVD.
So, and we'll get into that as well. So he went out and in that camp, so we had Steve Borden, who became Sting. There was the guy who played the Angel of Death. They had two other bodybuilders named Garland Donahoe and Mark Miller that kind of... But apparently they did go to Memphis with the Warrior and Sting when they sent out the promo packages. They didn't really have proper training. I guess Red Bastien had helped them out a little bit. But there was another wrestler in that camp that people don't know about. And this guy was a physical specimen too. His name was Steve Strong, or Steve DeSalvo was one of the ones he went. And he did fairly well in Canada and in Puerto Rico and Carlos Colon's territory. But Steve DeSalvo... There was another wrestler that came out in the late 70s, early 80s, and he was in that really bad Tarzan movie named Steve Strong. Kind of a surfer dude. It's not the same Steve Strong. If you saw Steve Strong, you know the Steve Strong I'm talking about. But Steve DeSalvo, he worked on the independents after that camp. He went to Montreal and worked for international wrestling run by the Britos. And also, he did a lot of time out in Calgary Stampede run by Stu Hart. And he was called Steve DeSalvo, Strangler Steve, and in Montreal he was called Sadistic Steve Strong, and he was a specimen as well. But there was an interview with him on a Canadian newspaper. He lives in Minnesota. He was retired. This is probably about 10 years old now. But he said that in that camp he was the only one that paid his fees to get trained.
Yeah, I mean, you passed that along to me, which I thought was humorous because there was a whole gaggle of people who apparently did that very short training course. It was something like 10 hours of training or some very small number. Yeah, so and I got a kick out of that because like the Warrior often refers to about when him and Sting left, when they went out to Memphis, they were always stuck for money, and they'd bug Ed Connors to wire them money all the time. I hope Jim Hellwig paid him back. One would hope, yeah.
But
although I can't see Ed holding it against him. Ed is a real kind soul. You can tell that Ed, in fact, interesting side note on the money thing, Ed is the person who bought Jim's first makeup kit for him.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
And you're also going to tell me something else about another bodybuilder who had something to do with Jim Hellwig and Ed Connors, were you not?
Yeah, so Ed was telling me, and I had never heard this before, probably because it never gained any legs, but there was another bodybuilder there in the late 80s, early 90s by the name of Jim Quinn.
Oh, yeah, I remember Jim Quinn.
Yeah, okay, so Jim Quinn is a little bit shorter than Hellwig. He's about 6'1", but I mean, he is just jacked.
He also competed in the World Bodybuilding Federation that Vince McMahon ran too.
Yes, he did. And Ed actually had proposed an idea to both of the gyms, which is that he thought they looked enough alike that they could both be the Ultimate Warrior and trade off doing the gimmick to preserve their bodies over the long haul instead of just Jim Hellwig taking the brunt of the beating all the time as the Ultimate Warrior.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it was something that never took off. But for Ed Connors, he thought that Jim Quinn could not only pull it off as the look of the Ultimate Warrior and the physique of the Warrior, but he felt that this was an interesting thing about our interview. He always told Jim to not get too cocky or arrogant about the Ultimate Warrior because he told Jim, he said, Jim, if Vince McMahon can't find someone to replace you, I can. I can go down to Gold's and I can definitely find someone that's got a physique like yours who can run in, shake the ropes, paint his face, and do what you do in the ring.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so he was the one tried to keep Jim very humble through the years because at least in his opinion, Jim Hellwig was not irreplaceable as the Ultimate Warrior. He said he thought it was a great character, but he did believe somebody else could do it if they had the right tools available.
Well, now looking back, we know that nobody could have because there's only one Jim Hellwig. But so he went to Memphis, and I don't know if people ever kind of followed some of their progression. Their matches were pretty bad, and I'm speaking as somebody who's a trained professional wrestler who worked in the business.
Right.
But what people need to understand when people take shots at the Warrior is that wrestling is such a difficult business. People have no idea. There's a lot of politics. One of the reasons I got out of professional wrestling in the mid to late 90s is I was in pretty good shape. I was one of the stronger wrestlers on the circuit. I had a good personality. I had a ways to go. You can never get better. You can never learn your craft enough. There's always stuff to learn. But I had an incident with a very big promoter in Canada after I had a match in Montreal on the Independents. This was someone I watched on TV as a kid, and he pulled me aside in the dressing room, and he said, "You know, kid, you've got a lot of potential. You've got a great physique." He said, "You know, just keep working on your physique. Keep working on this." He gave me a few pointers. I won't mention his name, but I said, "Thank you, sir, thank you," and he gave me his number, and he said that next time he would be up in Stanford, he would talk to Pat Patterson, although that name does give, when you understand the inside scoop, it can give you the shivers down your spine. So I wasn't too crazy about that. But anyway, a week later, I was at another wrestling card, and he was there, and I went up to shake his hand, and he just walked by me like he didn't remember me. I'd already had some injuries, and I remember that really put the politics really kind of put me off, and and I mean, if there were things going on that people were doing to get a push, so to speak, you hear a lot of rumors of that in the business. I wasn't willing to do it. So, but anyway, so for Hellwig to navigate those waters, I think he always knew he wasn't the best, but he took what his strengths were and applied it and concentrated more on his strengths. But chronologically, before we move forward, when he did get to Memphis and shortly after he went to the UWF, I mean, he was a physical specimen. He wasn't as lean and as tanned as when he kind of polished his physique up to really make strides in the WWE, but he was a monster. And if anyone's seen him lifting, Sting even said, I don't know if you caught Sting's Hall of Fame speech, was it last year? Or the year before? But he said, I was 260 pounds and I was jacked, but he said Jim Hellwig is 285 and I felt like a kid next to him. He was just so massive. Yeah. But another thing that people don't really realize too about Jim Hellwig is that he was married. He married actually pretty young. He was at 1981. He married Sherry, I believe her name was.
Yep, Sherry Tyree.
Yeah. Now, I heard an interview with her. I am going to talk about steroids, but I want to do it in a respectful way because I don't want family members mad at me or whatever. But she said in an interview that I think she met Jim and was it 81?
Yeah, that sounds about right. I'd have to take a look at. I've got their marriage record and their divorce records and so forth. Yeah, but that's right around there.
So she said that he had been on steroids for, she said, years when they met, and he was already really massive. So we know that's it's very common. I mean, let's just be honest about it. I don't think that's probably something Ed Connors really got into talking about, because a lot of people on the outside would look at that and say, well, gee, why don't they talk about steroids? But like in bodybuilding, it's like part of the culture. It's funny, I was at a bodybuilding expo in Toronto. It's the biggest bodybuilding expo in Canada a couple of months ago, and I was showing this woman, she's my dentist, and I showed her some pictures of me with some fitness celebrities, and she said, gee, she said, are these people on steroids? I looked at her, I said, everybody is. It's a bodybuilding expo. Come on, where have you been?
Yeah. Like, well, and it's not like, it's not a big surprise, and Hellwig has never, at least to my knowledge, just outright denied that he ever did steroids. His big thing was to say that steroids didn't make him successful or what he was, which I agree with. That the steroids obviously are something not only that you do, for the size and everything, but sometimes wrestling is such a hard industry anyway.
Brutal.
I personally don't begrudge a single wrestler for taking whatever it is they need to take to keep their bodies functioning, because the damage that they are doing to themselves already is brutal. It's just a brutal industry.
Now, and we also know that legally on record, during the Zohorian trials for Vince McMahon, when the Warrior took the stand, he is on trial saying that he did use testosterone and decadurabolin. And there's an incident in the trial they talk about where he was in a hotel room in Washington, and I guess he forgot his steroids in the hotel room. And Vince McMahon freaked at him for that. But anyway, that's all public record. People can look that up. And but it just I get a kick out of it, having been in wrestling and having been around lifting and bodybuilding. Like when people, well, he used steroids. Like, so where have you been?
Like, it's a shocking thing. Yeah, it's like
people,
it's and especially in that era in 80s WWF. I mean, my word, if you weren't on steroids and doing blow and sleeping with 6 women a week, I mean, it's like, that was just that was the industry at the time. I mean, Warrior was, by the standards of that time, really toned down, considering that he wasn't the guy out partying big time. He wasn't the guy out there, snorting coke all the time and sleeping with everything that walked. I mean, those are the kinds of stories you hear about coming out of 1980s wrestling.
Oh, absolutely. So he went. So he was in Memphis, and he worked there on that card for a while. That was Jerry Lawler's territory. With Continental Wrestling was the actual term, I believe it might have been.
So we had it was I think he was UWF and then went to CWA.
CWA first.
CWA UWF, which was, I always know them as territories. Yeah. Which was the Watts territory. And the Watts territory did not last long. No. And whatever the issue was, there's the story where supposedly Watts wanted Warrior to get down on all fours to show him something, and Warrior had heard that Watts would then kick you and like break your ribs or something like that. So he wouldn't get down. He told Watts you had to put him down. I don't know exactly what happened, but what I do know is this. A couple of years ago, whenever I tried to get in contact with Bill Watts, he wouldn't speak to me about Warrior. He would just say this. He would say, I don't want to do an interview because I do not have one single kind thing to say about it.
Well, also, now, we also know that Scott Steiner had a problem with Bill Watts, too. Apparently, they had an encounter, too, at some point along those lines. I don't know all the details, so I won't speculate. So they went from Continental. Apparently, Jerry Jarrett, who you've been in touch with about Warrior, used them and helped them the best they could, and they sent him on to UWF. So the Warrior did say that about Jerry Jarrett. He did say that, they used us the best they could, and they moved us on to... was there anything when you talked with Jerry Jarrett that he had to say about Warrior, just kind of in a nutshell? Because I know they've had a tumultuous history.
Yeah, well, and the history itself, one of the two interesting things that I took from my interview with Jerry is, one is that the usual canonical story is that from the 4 men of Power Team USA, only Steve and Hellwig went down to perform for Jerry to try out for.
But it wasn't one of them.
Yeah, according to Jerry, he says that's not true. Jerry says that all 4 of the Power Team USA guys came down to him. So that's one of those stories where one of these days if I can ever get, Steve Borden or Garland Donahoe or one of those guys to confirm it, because that's not the typical canonical story.
No.
The other interesting thing about my conversation with Jerry is Jerry also, like Bill Watts, when I first approached him, which was around 2009, he also wouldn't talk to me. He said, my mother always said, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. It was only after Jim died and I reapproached him about speaking with me that he was finally at that point willing to talk to me, because he had so much bad blood with Jim over bringing him into their new, what is it, TNA? Yeah, TNA. Yeah, he was so frustrated with Jim trying to get him into TNA that he, again, just had just nothing but venom in his veins about dealing with Jim. And it was only after his death that he was able to come to terms with that.
Well, and Jim Hellwig in the shoot interview with Ringside Collectibles in 2006, he talks about that, and he says, look, you know, the Ultimate Warrior has value, and I'm not that silly kid that came into his territory not knowing anything. I had built up my character to have a worth, and if someone wants the Ultimate Warrior to come perform, I'm not going to go for $50 and a hot dog, and I don't have my ring gear half on, just waiting for a call.
Yeah.
So,
well, and the way that Jerry tells the story about the TNA thing is that they were bringing him in for a major role. Like, they were going to put a strap on him was the plan. And I think he wanted something like a minimum $100,000 contract, which they were going to do. Part of the problem is, and this is where Jerry finally lost it with him, is he said he probably sent Jim 30 different contracts. And that he would get a contract, and he said the most minute details would he send it back and want this, just little minutia. And he said probably 30 of these revisions he went through. And he said he finally was the one who cut off the negotiation and told him, said, Jim, I think you need help. I think you need help. Yeah, and the funny thing was, he was also at the same time, interestingly enough, trying to bring Macho Man into TNA.
Yeah.
And he said between the two of those men working at the same time, trying to get them both in, he said they drove me as close to a nervous breakdown as I've ever been in my life.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So that's pretty funny. Okay, so he moves from CWA and he goes to the UWF. Things really unravel, not just with his encounter with Bill Watts, but between Sting and the Warrior. Sting never really discussed this too much, but he did do... he had a discussion on the WWE network with JBL. And so it's interesting because that's the first time I've heard Sting address the breakup of the Blade Runners, which was the group that Warrior and Sting became. Initially they were called the Freedom Fighters, and then they became the Blade Runners, which they were more known as. And if you look on YouTube, there's different matches in UWF 1986 of the Blade Runners. And it's funny because Sting, when he's talking with JBL, he just said, man, that gym was intense, man. And he said that Sting said he was scheduled to go with Jim Hellwig, the Ultimate Warrior, to Dallas to work for Fritz Von Erich. People don't know that, but he said that Bill Watts held their checks back, and Sting had to go and work one more match so they could get their money. And for some reason, Jim Hellwig wasn't included in this match or whatever. And Sting went and worked, and I guess got the money, and I guess Hellwig just flipped right out, and it was mad at him, and he said to Jay, man, he just blew a gasket. He said, I was trying to explain Jim, I had to go and... So, I mean, there's always two sides to every story for sure, and I mean, as much of a fan as I was of Jim Hellwig growing up, I've been learned to, kind of also not just take his word as truth and sit back and say, okay, well, wait, like, what are some of the other factors here? But so in UWF, it fell apart. So, and the Warrior, as he talks about in that documentary that came out, that he was driving to Dallas, what was he, like in a used taxi cab with 500,000 miles on it or something?
Yeah, some crappy car, all of his possessions in a little bitty, one of those little U-Hauls that you can pull behind you. You basically had nothing at the time.
Yeah, and what I find amazing at that point when he was relaying that, a lot of people would have said, screw this, I'm out of this, I'm not doing this. Sting talks about how many times he just wished he went home in his T-Bird and said, okay, I'm going to get a day job. But so he goes to World Class Championship Wrestling in Dallas, which, we know is the Von Erich territory. Now, that was an interesting time. Anybody into wrestling and the Von Erich lore, like the Von Erichs, they had a couple of sons that died. I guess Mike Von Erich killed himself when the Dingo Warrior, that's who the Warrior became, at that time. He died. There's a lot going on there. Apparently, he really connected well with Kerry Von Erich. He really liked the Von Erichs, and they tried to start him out as a heel, but he became very popular down there. I remember reading in the magazines, they called it Dingo Wildfire. And it was taking off down there. He was so popular, and he grew his hair out, and you can start to see the beginnings of the Ultimate Warrior character. What interesting points do we have about his time in WCCW?
You know, one of the things, and I do a piece on this on the site, it's showing some pictures and stuff. The evolution of Hellwig to Dingo Warrior and the look of Dingo Warrior, to me, is the thing that most notably stands out, because he came to WCCW at an interesting time when the territory was starting to fade a little bit. WWF was becoming the juggernaut that they eventually become. They had lost some good talent. They'd had some tragedy amongst the Von Erichs. But when you look at Jim when he first goes in, so obviously, I mean, he's still massive at this time. You know, he's still weightlifter big, and he's got short hair, and he's got a mustache, and he starts to formulate the face paint that we know that became so iconic. And the face paint, when you look at it, you compare it to, say, like the Road Warriors. There's a lot of similarity there. You can see that he's kind of formulating an identity. And to me, the most notable thing about that time period is how his look begins to evolve, and it looks very similar to what we see with Kerry Von Erich. The long hair starts to come out. Jim starts to get down to the more trim, chiseled look, very similar to Kerry. When you start to look at it, and I don't know if it was directly conscious or a subconscious thing, but he starts to evolve to look a little bit more like Kerry Von Erich, who probably, you know, the most talented of the Von Erichs at that time. That's really where his look comes into play, is during that time in WCCW. And one wonders, if he had never gone there, would the Ultimate Warrior have been what it was? You know, it's one of those kind of caveats to his story.
Well, you told in your site, you do talk about an interesting thing that happens where I guess some people from high school, because they were getting the WCCW programming in Indiana, was trying to recognize him. And weren't some of the people from his high school, because some of the people from his high school showed up at some matches or something, and they wanted to meet him, and they talked to security, and there's an interesting part there that you had in the...
Yeah, and apparently this is something that happened more than once from interviews and stuff. But yes, there was an incident where a guy, he again, going back to that whole the small town chip on his shoulder thing, he had had some guys who showed up at one of his matches and tried to get backstage to see him. And he basically sent back a message saying, if I wasn't worth talking to in high school, I'm not worth talking to now.
Well, there's an interesting, that's a very interesting... keeping your standards, I guess you could call that.
Yes. And that was something that apparently was pretty standard with Jim, even going into their 10-year reunion. Even at his 10-year reunion, he was very good with his friends, and anybody who really messed with him in high school, he wouldn't have anything to do with, despite the fact that he had grown successful.
Yeah, and let's point out, too, at the 10-year reunion for his high school, he was already starting to really see some success and some momentum in the WWF.
Oh, yeah.
So in WCCW, I find another little tidbit interesting. There's a video going around on YouTube. It's Ric Flair doing a bit of a shoot about the Warrior, and he says about how the Warrior and Rick Rude. Now, Rick Rude had a reputation as being a real tough guy, and I don't know if you've seen this. But I heard this, and I knew it was bullshit right away, but apparently at some backstage in some WWF event, Rude and the Warrior had a bit of a tiff or whatever, and I guess as Flair put it, Rude put the boots to him or beat the shit out of him, but I just can't see that because they had history working together in WCCW. I think that's crap.
Well, and you know, Bret Hart also shares a similar story in his massive autobiography where he talks about something similar, not necessarily that Warrior got the shit beat out of him, but that basically Rude got so tired of taking hard bumps from him and from the stiff work that he straight up threatened him one after one show to knock his crap off. But yeah, they did have a history. They worked together in WCCW. Obviously, they worked quite a bit in WWF. He wasn't. I just recently talked to a guy who does quite a bit of history for WCCW. Rude wasn't his primary work partner when he was there. That apparently mostly was Bruiser Brody.
Yeah.
Bruiser Brody and Abdullah the Butcher were some of the common work buddies that he had during that time. But they definitely went back, and they worked together quite a bit then and also into the WWF.
Yeah, so now apparently there is a video out somewhere of a match between Warrior and Rick Rude, and during a spot, Rude says, you can see Rude saying to him, lighten up or I'm going to whatever, but I don't know. I mean, I kind of leave that. I don't know all about Ric Flair sometimes. And my thing about Bret Hart, as much as I respect him in the business, he kind of did a bit of a 180 about Jim Hellwig after he passed away. He was very anti-Warrior for a long time, and then when he dies, all of a sudden it's like, well, yeah, he was a great guy, and I remember all these. So
yeah,
we're going to talk about that because there's some. As someone, even though I just worked on the independents, I was, for a flash in the history of wrestling, but I picked up enough and heard enough about the Warrior. So from there, we all know the story about George Scott calling down and talking to the office. George Scott talking to New York and saying, look, there's this really talented kid here. And they fly him out to Anaheim, and Vince takes a look at him, meets him, and they call him out to Tyler, Texas to have just a tryout match. But the Dingo Warrior is already so popular in Texas, he got as big of a pop as everyone else, the big stars. So now, Jim Hellwig was very, very dedicated to his diet. And, I heard this through Wrestling Lore, but I also worked on a card in 1997 in Canada, and I was on the undercard, but Steve Lombardi was working the main event. And I had some time to talk with Steve, and, I was pretty jacked then. I used to always get a kick out of him when he'd say to me, why won't you tell me what drugs you're on? But I always got a kick out of the guy. He was quite funny, but we talked about the Warrior for a bit, and basically everything he said about the Warrior, it was what he said on the Self-Destruction of the Warrior DVD. But, Jim Hellwig, when he first got to the WWE, we called it WWF, but that's changed now. But it's well known. Lombardi told me himself, oh, you'd eat fucking tuna all the time. Oh, God, it stunk. Like, he would eat 6, 7, 8 cans of tuna a day, basically because that's all he could afford. But he was so dedicated to his diet because he knew that his body was his meal ticket.
Yeah. So, and there's an interesting story that circulates around, and that was funny because when I did my interview with Vince Russo, he asked me if I had heard this story, and I said, yes, I have actually, where for desserts, what Jim Hellwig would do is there'd be the catering table. He would take a cookie, he would crumble it in his hands, smell it really deeply, and then throw it away. Yeah. That was what he did for dessert.
Absolutely. And after he passed away, his wife talks about how dedicated. The only thing where he would deviate is if him and his family went to the movies, he'd bring some chocolate-covered almonds. Or on his birthday, she'd bake him a cake. On his birthday, she'd bake him a cake, and he'd have one little sliver of this coffee chocolate cake, and that was it.
Yeah.
But getting into the WWE, WWF, they kept him on the undercards. He wasn't on TV for a number of months. I believe it was June of '87 or July. It was the summer of '87 when he went over, because I remember reading about it in the wrestling magazines. He had his first match in Indianapolis, which you also referred to on the website. It was against Jose Estrada. Was it Jose Estrada? I believe that was his name. And some of his friends from high school were there, of course, because he didn't live too far from Indianapolis, or he didn't grow up. But and then once the wheels started going, again, such a tough business. Like, it's just so hard to convey to people how tough the wrestling business is.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, when I would work on the independents, I remember if you did a two-nighter, you weren't working out at the gym for a few days. Like, you were that. I've had matches where you're beat up for maybe a week. It's hard, but these guys had to work every night.
Yes.
And I don't know. I think the fee that he made was $100 a night, and he had his expenses paid. But I can't convey to people how tough it was, and he kept just working on his product. He talks about that famous thing about when he'd run out to the ring, shake the ropes, and when he'd get back, people would say, "Oh well, you're going to look stupid," but he kept doing it, and he listened to the fans, and just everything just seemed to really work out for him. Now, things do start to fall apart a little bit, and this is where we can get into talking about this. So he does WrestleMania 6 in Toronto, and he beats Hogan. And then that was in 1990. I think it was around. There was some discord between him and Vince over some payment or something, leading up to SummerSlam 91.
Yep.
And what I found really interesting on your website is you brought up some really good points. I never even thought of. I just thought, well, maybe Vince stiffed him or he owed him money and he's holding out on him. But you had some really interesting theories about why he had to be so demanding about his money.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, my primary, at least looking at the chronology of what was happening, it occurred to me that when all of the money stuff became an issue was around the time that Hellwig went through his divorce.
Yeah.
So Hellwig wins the title in 90. In early 91, he goes through a divorce. So they had all this division of assets. And it was funny, I actually ran this theory by Ed Connors when we talked. And Ed said, that's probably not a bad theory at all, because he said Jim did like nicer things in life. So he went through this divorce, and then it's later that year that the whole hold-up story takes place. Now, when we talk about the hold-up, because people tend to fall into one of two camps. People who like Warrior, defend him and say that it was money owed or this or that. People who don't go the opposite route. For me, I'm trying to look at this again from a scholarly source perspective.
Yeah.
There's nothing about this story that strikes me as being accurate that Vince would just fire Jim Hellwig for no reason. Vince McMahon, well documented, doesn't necessarily allow personal feelings towards people to influence his business decisions, which is one of the reasons why he has been so successful in business. Now, it's well known that at this time, Warrior had the strap for, a little less than a year or something like that. And Hogan, of course, has it back by the time the SummerSlam comes around when they're doing the match made in hell. Warrior, however, was still the number 2 draw in that company. I mean, he was a mega name. Why Vince McMahon would just fire Jim Hellwig for no reason makes very little sense. And even when you look now, whereas the WWE has, at least in my opinion, a very bad habit of rewriting narratives depending on how their relationship with someone goes. They have rewritten a lot of the Warrior narrative now, to where in the 2005 Self-Destruction DVD, he's a pariah. He's got all these problems. He mixes fantasy. 2014 comes around. He gets inducted to the Hall of Fame, and he dies. And he's a legend. He was a game changer. You can kind of play the videos one after another, and you're like, these are the same people telling different stories in a 9-year period of time. But the WWE has stuck to their guns about the hold-up story. And by the way, this was also being chronicled at the time by Dave Meltzer. He was also relaying at the time that the WWE had suspended him over a financial holdup. So what it kind of boils down to me is this. Either the WWE felt the need to plant some fake story about Warrior that they then perpetuated for decades, or he did exactly what they said he did. And I also know from having spoken with Lanny Poffo that this wasn't the only time he did it. He did it in independent realms as well. So this was an issue, and this really was, in a sense, the moment for Warrior, because this is when the relationship with WWE got its first real souring, and it never was the same after he was let go at the end of 91.
Well, leading up to that, it's out there on the internet about Warrior and McMahon had a couple of correspondences, I think before it hit the fan in 91, where Jim Hellwig, I think part of his issue was, I don't want to sound too pro-Warrior here, but he was like, look, you know, I appreciate the work, but like we bust our asses. Like, you know, how come you won't give us any holidays? All we do is work. Like, you know, I'm killing myself here, and I don't sleep. And you could tell that McMahon was thinking of SummerSlam, and for business purposes was just placating him in his response. But there was some discord you could see in this. It's public. It's out there. You can find it on the internet. The correspondence between the two. I don't remember all the details, but I mean, at the time they were saying too. I think the Warriors' income was about $1.5 million a year.
Yeah, that sounds about right. It was. I mean, it was pretty high at the time. Yeah, he was. But one of the things that came out of that whole issue with the money, and this is again, I kind of think back to Ed Connors when Ed was telling me that, you know, he always told Jim, "Don't get greedy, don't get greedy." Is that Warrior wanted, at least as Ed remembers, Warrior not only wanted a greater percentage of merchandising, but you know, he was really looking for Hogan money.
Yeah.
Which he wasn't making. And, you know, truth be told, when you're looking at it from the WWE standpoint, the fact that they had him drop the belt to Slaughter, which I think was in January of 91, around that time, that tells you that whatever it was that was going on in terms of him as the champion and the face of the company, it just wasn't quite the draw that they were hoping it was.
Yeah.
Warrior theoretically was Vince's insurance policy for when Hogan went to Hollywood and started making more and more movies and was working less and less.
No, absolutely he was. It's very true.
Yeah.
So he's let go at SummerSlam. And he disappears. Now, this is when we start leading into the whole steroid, Dr. George Zahorian trials, the witch hunt, so to speak. And the climate of wrestling changes. Like it's starting to get into some hard times in the 90s. And also, WCW is moving up as a competitor. So during this whole George Zahorian thing, they bring the Warrior back. So they reintroduce him. I don't remember the exact WrestleMania number. It was in Indianapolis at the Hoosier Dome during the Hulk Hogan Sid Justice match. He comes in to stop Papa Shango and Sid Justice from pounding on Hogan or whatever. They play the music.
Right.
So the Warrior runs down to the ring, and even back then, I remember when I saw it, I said, it looks like somebody might be a little bit off his cycling regimen and not working out as much. Not to say that he wasn't still in decent shape, but he just didn't look like the rock hard version of the Ultimate Warrior. So I don't kind of know what was going on there because he did kind of get himself in better shape, but maybe he went in on short notice. But I looked to me like, honestly, just being honest to the viewers as a bodybuilder, it looked like he had went off cycle for a while, and he probably was still working out because I think that's just how Jim Hellwig is. But he was probably like, oh shit, I got to get my ass back in gear, and he just didn't have enough time. Not to say that the condition he looked in, a lot of people would kill to be in, but
oh yeah, absolutely,
the standard of the Ultimate Warrior. So he came back, and this is during the whole witch hunt, the steroid trials. The Warrior was subpoenaed and had to go in on trial, as all of the wrestlers did. Rick Rude, there's all kinds of public documentation out there that you can find. But the notable climate, it changes. The wrestlers are smaller. A lot of the really hardcore steroid guys, some of them disappear. The Warriors still look good, but he wasn't as big, and I would attribute that to his diet and his dedication to working out. But I also think that they probably had some other doctors and medical people behind the scenes also helping them to maintain what they could. I can't prove that, but I just understand that for a lot of bodybuilders and their physique, like it's like when the whole testing came in, or it's like when Vince McMahon also got into that World Bodybuilding Federation, and he tried to go head to head against the Weeders, and it didn't work because of the trials. So if you look at the first show, the first professional WBF show, there was no testing. And then when you go to the second WBF show, they're tested, and you can tell looking at them, it's like these poor bodybuilders. It's like when you take away their steroids, it's like taking away construction workers' hard hat. Like it's part of the tools of the trade, right?
But I would say to Jim Hellwig's credit, when you look at pictures of Hogan in 1990 versus WCW Hogan, he's radically smaller. I mean, he major deflated. Jim Hellwig at least gets the credit for the fact that when he probably completely cycled off, he still worked his butt off and still had a hell of a physique about him.
No, absolutely. He's probably 15, 20 pounds lighter than at his...
Yeah.
But... So then they come to another point. Now, my understanding from what I had heard was that during the trials, you and I didn't. I've dug this up since you and I had talked last, but I guess between Davey Boy Smith and the Warrior, they had a contact in England that they were getting growth hormone from. So at the time, they didn't have the technology to check for growth hormone, and now in the more recent Warrior documentary after he passed away, Vince just said, well, look, this isn't right. But that's not what happened. I guess there was a concern about the tracing and the tracking of the growth hormone shipments being tied to the Warrior, then being tied to Vince during the whole trial. So it was like, okay, yeah, we don't want anything to do with you right now. You're dirty.
Mm-hmm. And that's probably pretty accurate.
Yeah.
The concept of Warrior getting suspended for the drug policy, which seems to be pretty much just a bad joke for the WWF when you see some of the stuff that has gone on. If we're going to say, and I think it's accurate to say, that Warrior really screwed up the first time, yes, the whole idea that he and Davey Boy were scapegoats for whenever Congress was trying to nail Vince McMahon is really who they were after. The United States government was really going after Vince McMahon. They were trying to jail him. And Vince thought he was going to get jailed. He was making preparation behind the scenes for expecting he was going to be in jail. Yeah, I would say it's very fair to say that Davey Boy and Warrior were definitely scapegoats for Vince just to try to look good.
And it's funny because when you look back at that, it's funny because, I mean, really the whole problem with steroids is cheating in sports. And but the testing, it's just so ridiculous because pro wrestling is entertainment. It's not a sport. But these are incredible athletes that do what they do in the ring. But it's just so funny. It's like, well, why are they getting penalized? It's not a competition. It's like But
well, whose record is on the line? Yeah. Exactly. It's silly, and I don't know. I think it personally reflects a lot of, why does the United States government spend so much time on these cases anyway? Like, what was all of that investment about going after, say, Barry Bonds really about?
Yeah.
I mean, just personal opinion as someone who lives here in the United States, there are more important things going on in this country and have been for a long time than athletes using steroids.
Well, the funny thing is that the laws in the States regarding steroids, they're pretty crazy. Like, I mean, and this is only my opinion. So in Canada, and I believe England as well, you're allowed to have them in your possession. So like if you were in Canada or in the UK and you're driving around and you had some steroids in your passenger seat and you got pulled over by the cops and they said, what's that? You say, well, it's my steroids. I use them. Okay, no problem. See you later. Worst that could happen is the police might confiscate them. But the issue in these countries is if your intent to distribute on a mass scale, I believe. In the States,
makes sense.
In the States, if you are caught with a vial or an ampule or any type of anabolic steroid, and you don't have a prescription, you are screwed, my friend. You are going to be in serious trouble. I have a very good friend of mine. He's a Canadian national level bodybuilder, and he's just jacked. And he meant to go to the States. And he forgot that he did have a syringe with testosterone in it because he wanted to do a shot right before he crossed the border. And it's a term they call front loading. Is when you take more to carry you further. But anyway, and he was honest with the U.S. Customs, and they dragged him in a room and they terrorized him for like hours. But then, as a sick joke, when they sent him, he just said, "Look, like my GPS, I didn't mean to come here. I was supposed to come here, like." And he said, I'm just being honest and this and that. And they really freaked him out. And then they called the Canadian Customs on the way back. So then the Canadian Customs came in and and he said, look, is this a joke? And they said, yeah, it is. They called us, but go ahead. But because he said, I don't want to go in the States. I'm sorry. Anyway, it's so draconian. Like I just think like
Oh
trying
yeah.
to, if I was a professional bodybuilder in the United States, I would probably just stay covered up all the time and not want anyone to see my body. But so when you have
Yeah.
some of these guys in the States who are well known in the fitness industry, like Rich Piana or Boston Lloyd, and they're open about their use on their YouTube channels, I'm like, man, I don't know if that's the brightest thing. But anyway, my little talk about the laws there. But in the States at the time, it was very hairy with the stuff that was going on. So the Warrior is left again. He was suspended and he's out for a couple of years.